January 15, 1944. Snow muffled the moans of the battlefield near the Belgian border. In the haze of burnt armor and frozen earth, British engineers huddled over the blackened remains of what was once believed to be an invincible beast, the German Panther tank. Its armor, glistening under the grey light of dawn, was ruptured, torn open like a wound that should never have existed. The air stank of cordite and diesel, and somewhere beyond the smoke, artillery murmured like a restless god. The men did not speak. They didn't need to. What they saw before them contradicted everything Allied intelligence believed. The Panther, Germany's technological pride, its perfect predator, had bled. The Panther had been conceived in secrecy after the shock of the Soviet T-34's appearance in 1941. Designed with sloped armor, superior firepower, and terrifying speed, it embodied Nazi engineering ambition, a machine meant to dominate Europe's plains and crush Allied steel beneath its treads. It was supposed to be untouchable. British reports from earlier months described the Panther's glacis plate, the sloped front armor, as immune to any shell under 75 mm. Crews spoke of shells ricocheting harmlessly, of enemy rounds sparking like rain against stone. Yet here, in the cold January mud, lay proof that something had gone terribly wrong. Captain Harold Miles, a mechanical engineer from Leeds, moved closer, running a gloved hand over the jagged breach near the lower hull. The impact wasn't random. The hole was precise, surgical. The entry point suggested not brute force, but a flaw, a structural weakness hidden beneath the armor's apparent perfection. He ordered the wreck hauled to a secure site for dismantling. No one yet understood that this ruined carcass would ignite one of the most secretive technical investigations of the war, an inquiry that would not only expose the myth of German invincibility but would also rewrite the battlefield calculus of armored warfare. Beneath the frost and silence, the truth of the Panther's vulnerability was beginning to stir, and it would not stay buried for long. The wreck was transported under strict secrecy to an isolated British testing ground in southern England, guarded as if it were a captured spy. The engineers who worked on it operated under code names, their findings restricted even from senior officers. Inside the hangar, under dim electric lights, the great carcass of the Panther loomed over them like a sleeping monster. Every dent, scorch mark, and fracture was documented. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed through the steel rafters as the team began peeling back the tank's armor, layer by layer, searching for the reason it had fallen. When the first plates were removed, the truth began to whisper through the metal. Beneath the surface, they found small crystalline patterns, tiny fractures that spidered outward from each rivet and weld. The armor, though thick and sloped, was brittle. At high impact, it shattered instead of bending. It was the first hint that something within Germany's celebrated metallurgical process had gone wrong. The steel that was meant to be indestructible was failing under pressure, not from weak design, but from desperation. By late 1943, the Allied bombing campaign had crippled Germany's industrial base, and the flow of high-quality manganese, essential for tough, flexible armor, had been severed. In its place, German factories were forced to substitute with inferior materials sourced from occupied territories. The result was catastrophic, armor that looked invincible but fractured like glass when struck in the right place. As the British engineers mapped out the cracks, they noticed an even more disturbing pattern. The most consistent failures appeared near the tank's lower hull, where the sloped armor met the flat underside. There, stress converged and reverberated. A direct hit at that junction could bypass the thick glacis and rip straight through to the ammunition racks or fuel tanks. This flaw was invisible from a distance, hidden by the sleek geometry of the Panther's design. Yet on the battlefield, under the right conditions, it turned the beast's strength into its doom. Each new discovery deepened the engineers' unease. They weren't simply dissecting a machine, they were uncovering the ghosts of Germany's engineering arrogance. The Panther, once hailed as a symbol of unstoppable progress, had betrayed its own creators. What began as a triumph of design was unraveling into a parable of industrial decay, war fatigue, and a nation's quiet descent into flawed perfection. By February 1944, fragments of the Panther's armor were being shipped to laboratories across Britain, Birmingham, Farnborough, and the Royal Ordnance testing sites in Shoeburyness. Metallurgists, many of whom had spent their careers building rather than breaking machines, now worked day and night to understand the enemy's masterpiece. Under microscopes, they examined the steel's grain structure. What they found shocked even the most seasoned scientists. The once celebrated German, rolled homogeneous armor, was riddled with impurities. Sulfur traces, high phosphorus levels, and uneven heat treatment revealed a desperate production environment where precision had been sacrificed to speed. Germany's armored might was decaying from within. Reports from Allied intelligence confirmed the engineers' fears. The Panther's rapid development after the T-34's debut had left design flaws unresolved. Factories were pushed to deliver thousands of units on impossible deadlines. Welding was done under unregulated conditions, plates were hardened too fast, leading to microfractures that spread with every jolt of the engine. The British analysts realized that even when untouched by enemy fire, many Panthers were effectively self-destructing, their transmissions seizing, their suspensions fracturing. The tank's myth of perfection had been built on a crumbling foundation of rushed innovation and dwindling resources. Still, the flaw in the lower hull, the one Captain Miles had discovered, haunted them. It was too precise, too catastrophic to be random. Tests using captured 6-pounder and 17-pounder shells confirmed a horrifying truth. A well-aimed strike where the sloped glacis met the flat lower plate caused a chain reaction. The weld line, acting as a fault, concentrated shock waves that shattered the armor's crystalline structure. When hit there, even the Panther's thick skin could split open like a seam under pressure. What had once been its most formidable defense, the elegant sloping armor, became the focus point of its destruction. By spring, the findings were compiled into a classified report titled Vulnerability Analysis of German Panther Mark V tank. Few outside the War Office would ever see it. The data was considered a matter of tactical secrecy, a key to future victories. Yet for those who worked on it, the emotional weight was profound. The Panther had become more than an enemy artifact, it was a tragic symbol of human obsession with perfection, collapsing under the unbearable strain of war's reality. Beneath its steel hide, the engineers saw not strength, but fragility, the reflection of a nation breaking apart, molecule by molecule. The revelations about the Panther's armor spread quietly through the highest levels of Allied command. In dim war rooms, under the hum of cigarette smoke and rationed coffee, the data was whispered between strategists and field commanders. They now held a weapon of knowledge, one that could turn the tide in armored engagements if used precisely. But secrecy was paramount. To let Germany know that its most feared tank had been compromised would be to invite correction. So, the Flaw was buried under layers of classified orders, known only to a few trusted units and engineers. At the Lulworth Gunnery School in Dorset, British crews were trained under the guise of advanced impact testing. In truth, they were rehearsing how to strike the Panther's hidden weakness. The engineers from Farnborough supplied detailed schematics, showing the vulnerable weld seam between the upper and lower plates. Range officers instructed gunners to aim not for the turret or the broad hull, but low, precisely where the slope met the flat front. The adjustment was minute, almost imperceptible, yet it made the difference between survival and annihilation. In field tests, the results were staggering. A single 17-pounder shell, properly placed, could gut a Panther in one hit. As this knowledge spread among select units, a quiet confidence replaced fear. The once invincible predator of Europe's fields could now be slain with precision and discipline. But the engineers knew that technical flaws were only part of the story. Germany's obsession with mechanical superiority had created tanks too complex for the war they were fighting. Each Panther required over 150,000 labor hours to build, an industrial vanity project compared to the rugged, easily produced Shermans rolling off American lines. The more Germany tried to perfect the Panther, the more it crippled its own war machine. Meanwhile, intercepted German communications painted a grim picture. Tank commanders reported catastrophic armor failures, unexplained ruptures, and sudden fires. Some believed Allied forces had developed a secret new shell. Others blamed sabotage. None realized that the Flaw was of their own making, born not from espionage or divine luck, but from the metallurgical decay of a nation running out of time. In the laboratories and bunkers of Britain, the engineers continued their work, watching as the Panther's myth crumbled under the weight of its own steel. The secret they carried would never be shouted from rooftops, it would whisper only through the smoke of battles yet to come. The revelations about the Panther's armor spread quietly through the highest levels of Allied command. In dim war rooms, under the hum of cigarette smoke and rationed coffee, the data was whispered between strategists and field commanders. They now held a weapon of knowledge, one that could turn the tide in armored engagements if used precisely. But secrecy was paramount. To let Germany know that its most feared tank had been compromised would be to invite correction. So, the Flaw was buried under layers of classified orders, known only to a few trusted units and engineers. At the Lulworth Gunnery School in Dorset, British crews were trained under the guise of advanced impact testing. In truth, they were rehearsing how to strike the Panther's hidden weakness. The engineers from Farnborough supplied detailed schematics, showing the vulnerable weld seam between the upper and lower plates. Range officers instructed gunners to aim not for the turret or the broad hull, but low, precisely where the slope met the flat front. The adjustment was minute, almost imperceptible, yet it made the difference between survival and annihilation. In field tests, the results were staggering. A single 17-pounder shell, properly placed, could gut a Panther in one hit. As this knowledge spread among select units, a quiet confidence replaced fear. The once invincible predator of Europe's fields could now be slain with precision and discipline. But the engineers knew that technical flaws were only part of the story. Germany's obsession with mechanical superiority had created tanks too complex for the war they were fighting. Each Panther required over 150,000 labor hours to build, an industrial vanity project compared to the rugged, easily produced Shermans rolling off American lines. The more Germany tried to perfect the Panther, the more it crippled its own war machine. Meanwhile, intercepted German communications painted a grim picture. Tank commanders reported catastrophic armor failures, unexplained ruptures, and sudden fires. Some believed Allied forces had developed a secret new shell. Others blamed sabotage. None realized that the Flaw was of their own making, born not from espionage or divine luck, but from the metallurgical decay of a nation running out of time. In the laboratories and bunkers of Britain, the engineers continued their work, watching as the Panther's myth crumbled under the weight of its own steel. The secret they carried would never be shouted from rooftops, it would whisper only through the smoke of battles yet to come. By mid-1944, the truth about the Panther's fragility began to manifest across the European front lines. When Operation Goodwood and the subsequent push toward Falaise commenced, Allied gunners, those few briefed under strict confidentiality, began testing their new knowledge under fire. In the chaos of Normandy's hedgerows, amidst the shriek of artillery and the stench of diesel, they aimed deliberately low. Reports filtered back through field channels, Panthers that once shrugged off countless hits were erupting into flames from a single, precisely placed strike. Crews spoke in disbelief as German armor, once a symbol of terror, now lay smoldering in ditches and crossroads. Inside German lines, confusion rippled like static. Engineers at MAN and Daimler-Benz factories received urgent telegrams from the front demanding explanation for these inexplicable penetrations. Some officers accused frontline crews of cowardice, others of poor maintenance, but the truth was far more damning. The Panther's own design, its proud sloped front meant to deflect shells, was betraying it under battlefield stress. Every weld that once gleamed with precision now carried invisible fractures, waiting for the precise shock that would turn strength into ruin. Even the most elite divisions, the 12th SS Panzer and Grossdeutschland, began reporting catastrophic front armor failures. In secret workshops across Germany, frantic tests were conducted to replicate the damage. Metallurgists found the same crystalline brittleness, the same pattern of failure at the lower glacis seam. Manganese shortages, combined with rushed quenching techniques and untrained laborers, had created an armor that was strong only in theory. The Panther was never truly invincible, It had only seemed so because its weakness had yet to be discovered. Now that it had, the illusion of superiority was collapsing faster than the Reich could adapt. Meanwhile, in a small British archive room, Captain Miles read the new combat reports in silence. The flaw he and his team had unearthed months earlier was now shaping the war's outcome, yet it would never bear their names. No medals, no public acknowledgement, no glory. Their triumph was buried in the shadows, known only through the increasing wrecks of Panther tanks strewn across France. The engineers had exposed the heart of Germany's armored legend and found it hollow. What they had done was more than scientific, it was poetic. The machine built to dominate Europe was now devouring itself from within, undone by the very perfection it was meant to embody. As Allied forces pressed eastward through the shattered towns of Normandy, the German High Command struggled to mask the spreading panic within its armored divisions. At Hitler's Wolfschanz headquarters, reports from field commanders grew increasingly frantic. Entire Panther platoons were being lost to what appeared to be lucky Allied hits. Some generals demanded the development of new armor compounds. Others pleaded for production halts until the flaw could be corrected. But the Reich was no longer a machine of precision, it was a factory of chaos. Bombers thundered above every industrial district, and each month the quality of steel declined further. What had once been a technological marvel had turned into a fragile monument to Germany's desperation. Inside the sprawling steelworks of the Ruhr Valley, the signs of decay were everywhere. Bomb craters surrounded furnaces. Manganese, the critical element once imported from Ukraine and the Balkans, had become unobtainable. To keep production alive, German metallurgists substituted nickel and vanadium in uneven ratios, producing armor that was alternately too soft or too brittle. In laboratories, test plates shattered under pressure. Engineers buried the failed samples to hide the evidence. The once celebrated Panther project, designed to symbolize industrial superiority, now represented the slow collapse of German engineering under wartime starvation. Captured diaries from German technicians revealed the silent despair behind the Panther's myth. One entry, later found near Kassel, described the steel crying under our hammers, and noted that every weld is a prayer, every plate a gamble. The author, believed to be a junior metallurgist, spoke of building tanks that looked strong but felt tired before they ever reached the front. These words, never meant for foreign eyes, exposed the moral exhaustion beneath the Reich's machinery. The engineers no longer served a vision of victory, they served the illusion of endurance. Meanwhile, Allied analysts consolidated their findings into intelligence briefings shared with American tank divisions. By the time U.S. forces reached Belgium, gunners of the 3rd Armored Division had been discreetly trained on the Panther's precise weak points. Every Panther left burning on the roadside was no longer just a tactical win, it was a symbol of industrial truth triumphing over propaganda. The Invincible tank, once the embodiment of German pride, now lay exposed under the open sky, its secret flaw glinting like a scar across the twisted steel of a dying empire. By autumn 1944, the myth of the Panther's dominance was unraveling faster than German command could conceal it. Along the Siegfried Line, Allied crews approached each engagement not with fear, but with clinical precision. The flaw was no longer theory, it was doctrine. British Firefly tanks, armed with the long 17-pounder gun, began using specialized training footage that showed slowed-down footage of shells striking the Panther's lower glacis seam. The results were devastating. On impact, the weld line acted like a fault line, and the armor peeled back under its own kinetic shock. Crews who once prayed before firing now watched through periscopes as Germany's Invincible beast collapsed in seconds. In the ruins of Cologne, Allied photographers captured footage that would later define the Panther's downfall, a single tank standing in the open square, its armor breached precisely where the British engineers had predicted months before. To the casual eye, it was just another battlefield wreck, but to those in the intelligence corps, it was proof of concept brought to life. The flaw had gone from a classified discovery to a cinematic confirmation of science overpowering myth. The engineers who once toiled in silence could only watch as the truth unfolded through film reels and intelligence memos, their invisible work now echoing across the front lines. Inside Germany, however, the story was far from over. Nazi propagandists worked tirelessly to hide the vulnerability, broadcasting images of freshly painted Panthers rolling off assembly lines, their armor gleaming in the sun. Yet behind those photographs lay factories filled with fear. Workers whispered about armor cracking under stress tests, of hulls rejected by inspectors but shipped anyway under orders marked dringend, immediate deployment. For every new Panther that rolled into combat, 2 were immobilized within weeks, either destroyed, abandoned, or broken beyond repair by their own faulty transmissions. In a small testing ground near Kummersdorf, German engineers conducted one final desperate experiment, retempering the steel using chemical processes never before tried at industrial scale. The results were catastrophic. The armor warped, the plates buckled, and several test tanks detonated from internal stress during live fire. With resources dwindling and the Allies closing in, the Reich's dream of an indestructible war machine dissolved into a nightmare of broken metal and unspoken shame. By the end of 1944, the engineers who once boasted of creating perfection now stood in silence, watching the Panther's legend sink beneath the ruins of their collapsing world. Winter descended on Europe in 1944, cloaking the remains of battlefields beneath a thin veil of snow. The Panther, once the symbol of Germany's armored supremacy, now appeared not as a weapon of terror but as a relic of hubris, its charred frames scattered across frozen forests and ruined villages. Allied units advancing through the Ardennes found the wrecks half buried in ice, their hulls torn open at the same fatal seam. Engineers followed in their wake, documenting each destroyed tank with clinical precision. Every twisted plate, every fractured weld, was another confirmation of the flaw that had changed the war's rhythm. What had begun as an obscure metallurgical anomaly had evolved into a decisive turning point in mechanical warfare. At the Royal Armament Research Department, analysts compiled thousands of field reports into what would become a classified technical archive. The documents painted a haunting picture of industrial collapse hidden behind the facade of Nazi efficiency. They recorded not just design errors, but a moral erosion, the slow decay of a nation's discipline under the weight of total war. Each failed Panther was evidence that Germany's technological brilliance had been consumed by its own obsession with perfection. The engineers who once viewed steel as a reflection of national pride now confronted it as a symbol of decay. Their creation, intended to dominate the continent, had instead mirrored their country's disintegration. Meanwhile, in Germany's hidden foundries, a grim awareness had taken hold. Reports from the Reich's metallurgical institutes were now written in guarded, almost mournful tones. Manganese reserves were gone, coal supplies erratic, and the power grid fractured by nightly bombings. Workers smuggled personal notes inside tank components, messages of fear, confession, and exhaustion. One fragment, found decades later in a derelict Panther hull near Aachen, read simply, "This steel is tired. It no longer wants to fight." By the final months of 1944, the Panther's failure had transcended machinery. It had become a silent allegory, a nation's descent written in metal. The very tank meant to project invulnerability had exposed the fragility of the system that built it. In every fractured weld and brittle plate lay a truth the world was never meant to see, that beneath the banners, the propaganda, and the promises of superiority, the Reichs might have been an illusion, forged from fear, desperation, and the slow death of integrity under fire. As the new year of 1945 emerged amid smoke and ruin, the Panther's decline became unmistakable across every front where German armor still attempted to hold ground. When the Ardennes offensive began, the last major German gamble of the war, Panther battalions rolled forward through the snowbound forests, sleek silhouettes moving like phantoms in the winter haze. Yet beneath their imposing presence lay the same structural fragility that had haunted engineers since Normandy. During the opening days alone, multiple Panthers were found abandoned without enemy fire, victims of fractured suspensions, shattered final drives, or armor plates that had split under the tremors of their own guns. The battlefield no longer feared the machine feared the battlefield. British intelligence teams embedded with American units documented each failure meticulously. As they moved through Malmedy, La Gleize, and St. Vith, they inspected Panther hulls left along frozen roadside ditches. Many showed the now familiar pattern, an impact near the lower glacis seam that had blossomed into a catastrophic rupture. Others bore internal stress fissures, branching through the steel-like veins of frost, revealing that the tank's skin was decomposing even without combat. Engineers in London compared these findings to the metallurgical samples taken months earlier and realized the flaw had worsened with each new production batch. The steel had crossed a threshold where structural integrity could no longer be trusted. Every Panther emerging from late war factories was a machine born with its fate already written. Inside Germany, the crisis deepened. In the industrial ruins of Kassel and Nuremberg, Panther production lines limped forward under extreme duress. Power outages halted furnaces mid-process, freezing armor plates in imperfect states. Untrained laborers, many forced into service after the collapse of the Eastern Front, struggled to maintain tolerances once upheld by master craftsmen. Quality inspectors recorded their findings in coded language to avoid accusations of defeatism, noting irregular resilience, unpredictable tempering, and stress anomalies beyond correction. The Panther's armor was no longer steel, it had become a brittle shell, hardened by fear and warped by scarcity. By March, even German tank crews sensed the inevitability. Diaries recovered from vehicles abandoned near the Rhine spoke of engines that died without warning and armor that rang like glass when hit. One commander wrote of hearing the hull crack internally after firing the main gun, describing the sound as a quiet breaking, like something giving up. The Panther, once a symbol of strength, now carried a quiet sorrow within its steel frame, a mechanical echo of a nation reaching the end of its endurance. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in the spring of 1945, the Panther's final chapter unfolded across landscapes scarred by fire and retreat. In towns such as Remagen, Wesel, and Paderborn, the once dreaded silhouette of the Mark V tank lay scattered in various stages of collapse. Some rested half submerged in mud, their hulls split open along the same lower glacis seam that British engineers had first identified more than a year earlier. Others sat motionless on cobblestone streets, abandoned with engines still warm, their crews having fled after internal fractures rendered the machines immobile. The Panther's battlefield legacy had transformed from terror to testament, its wrecks marking the path of a war machine that had outpaced the empire sustaining it. American ordnance specialists, following close behind the advancing infantry, catalogued each wreck with the precision of archivists. They noted burst gearboxes, seized transmissions, and armor plates that had cracked cleanly along weld lines as though cleaved by invisible blades. Tanks destroyed by direct fire often displayed the same violent interior devastation, ammunition racks ignited by penetrations through the vulnerable hull junction, fuel drums ruptured by fragments of their own fractured armor. The patterns matched the technical analysis conducted months earlier in British laboratories, confirming that the Panther's downfall had been woven into its design long before it reached the battlefield. The flaw was no longer a secret, it was an inevitability laid bare along every German road. Within the Reich's remaining engineering circles, attempts to salvage the Panther grew increasingly desperate. In the ruins of factories bombed to skeletons, technicians experimented with alternative hardening methods, including surface carboizing and makeshift annealing processes performed with limited electricity. These measures, born of urgency rather than innovation, only worsened the tank's reliability. Test plates emerged from furnaces warped or riddled with microfractures, their surfaces exhibiting a dull, exhausted sheen. Engineers recorded these failures in terse, fragmented reports that read less like technical documents and more like confessions of a system collapsing under its own weight. Captured communications from late April revealed an unspoken resignation within German armored divisions. Commanders reported tanks immobilized by structural fatigue before ever encountering Allied fire. One surviving transmission from a retreating battalion near Magdeburg described a Panther hull, splitting at the front under its own motion, forcing the crew to abandon it along a forest road. By now, the Panther no longer symbolized technological superiority, it embodied the disintegration of an industrial giant that had gambled everything on perfection and met its end in the brittle echo of failing steel. As April 1945 bled into its final days, the remnants of the Panther fleet retreated toward the collapsing heart of the Reich. The roads leading into Berlin were choked with refugees, shattered wagons, and crippled armored vehicles. Among them, Panthers limped forward like wounded animals, tracks slipping, engines coughing, hulls creaking under their own weight. The flaw that British engineers had uncovered more than a year earlier had now become unmistakable even to those who had once denied it. In the dim light of burning suburbs, Panther crews inspected their machines with resigned silence, running gloved hands over fractures that spidered across the lower glacis. Each new fissure was a reminder that the steel meant to protect them had, instead, turned into an omen of their inevitable end. Inside Berlin, within makeshift workshops assembled in basements and ruined tram depots, mechanics worked on the last Panthers the city had left. By candlelight and generator-powered lamps, they attempted repairs that would once have been unthinkable, welding compromised armor, reinforcing cracked plates with scavenged steel, and cannibalizing vehicles too far gone to save. Sparks showered off hulls that no longer held together under stress. The steel, exhausted by rushed production and the strain of combat, had lost its resilience. Mechanics wrote brief notations on chalkboards mounted beside each tank, marking failures in terse phrases: nose split, drive housing fractured, front hull unstable. The Panther, designed to be the pinnacle of armored warfare, had become a symbol of deteriorating engineering held together only by desperation. In captured intelligence archives discovered near Potsdam, Allied analysts later uncovered German reports from the final weeks of the war. These documents revealed a stark transformation in tone. Early war confidence had been replaced by a quiet fatalism. Engineers acknowledged that resources for proper heat treatment no longer existed, that quality control had disintegrated under constant bombardment, and that the Panther's armor had reached a point where repairs could not restore structural integrity. One memorandum described the metal as fatigued beyond correction, noting that attempts to harden replacement plates resulted in spontaneous cracking during transport. Another warned that further welding of the lower glacis area risked causing the entire section to fail catastrophically under minimal dynamic stress. On the battle-scarred streets of central Berlin, the final Panthers entered combat with the weight of these truths embedded in their frames. They fired their last rounds amid collapsing buildings and advancing Soviet armor, each recoil sending tremors through their compromised hulls. Several fell not from enemy shells but from internal failures, armor seams splitting, transmissions locking, or suspension arms shattering as the city shook around them. Their hulks remained where they died, half buried in rubble and smoke, monuments to an engineering ambition undone by the very forces it sought to master. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the ruins of Europe bore quiet witness to the final fate of the Panther. Across fields, forests, and bombed-out cities, its hulls lay abandoned in every posture of defeat, some burned to skeletal frames, others resting intact but crippled by fractures invisible to the untrained eye. Allied recovery teams dispersed through the continent, cataloging the remnants of German armor with methodical detachment. As they lifted and inspected the Panthers one by one, the same truth emerged from every shattered seam and broken weld: the tank that had terrified continents had collapsed not through superior enemy fire, but through the slow erosion of its own industrial lifeblood. Beneath the outward shape of power, it had been a machine defined by fragility. In the months following victory, British and American analysts assembled their findings into an exhaustive technical chronicle. Thousands of samples were examined, armor plates sliced into cross-sections, welds etched with acid to reveal hidden weaknesses, gearboxes dismantled to their final cogs. The results confirmed what field engineers had long suspected: the Panther had never been suited to the brutal endurance of total war. Its complex suspension demanded a manufacturing precision Germany could no longer sustain. Its powerful gun and sloped armor concealed a hull whose structural integrity depended on materials that had vanished beneath blockade and bombardment. Late-war specimens showed steels hardened to brittleness, distorted under thermal stress, or cooled so unevenly that internal fissures were present before the tank ever met an Allied round. In the archives of Farnborough and the U.S. Aberdeen Proving Ground, these findings were stored alongside photographs of wrecked Panthers recovered from Normandy, the Ardennes, the Ruhr, and Berlin. Each image captured not triumph but truth. The Panther's story became a case study in how ambition can outpace capability, and how the illusion of invincibility can dissolve under the weight of flawed foundations. Engineers noted that while the tank possessed exceptional design principles on paper, it had been born into conditions that made perfection impossible. The final reports concluded that the Panther's battlefield failures had less to do with enemy weaponry than with the cumulative stresses of its own engineering compromises, stresses that no propaganda could hide and no late-war factory could repair. By the time peace negotiations reshaped Europe, the Panther had already transitioned from weapon to artifact. Its rusting hulks were collected as scrap or shipped to testing facilities for further study. Yet in museums and military archives, fragments of its armor remain preserved as silent exhibits, plates marked by ruptures at the lower glacis seam, welds frozen in the moment they failed, and crystalline fractures glowing under laboratory light. These remnants speak not of battlefield defeat, but of an empire undone by the limits of its own industrial reach. The Panther's story endures as a testament to the hidden realities behind war's grand machinery, a reminder that beneath the steel of every legend lies the human struggle to forge strength from a world collapsing around it.